My name is Raphael Bostic. I'd like to welcome you to the latest installation of Students Talk Back. I'm the director of the Bedrosian Center on Governance and the Public Enterprise, and our group is one of three that convenes these on a weekly basis. The other two are the Unruh Institute of Politics out of the Dornsife College, and the Tomas Rivera Policy Institute, which is out of the Sol Price School of Public Policy, which is also where we are. And the idea for these is to have a lunchtime venue to talk about issues, to talk about the intersection of policy, politics, and communications, as well as some social issues, and see where we fall out on these things. We started this about 2 years ago, looking at the political campaign for president. And as is typically the case, presidential campaigns touch on pretty much every issue. So it gave us an opportunity to talk about issues as well as how they were being cast in a political context. Since the election, we've pivoted to something a little different, which is to try to highlight some of the issues that may not have come up and been so prominent in the context of the presidential campaign, but which are important nonetheless. So last week, we had a very, very interesting conversation on issues of social justice, with a focus on how the University of Southern California relates to its neighbors and its neighborhoods, and some of the tensions and opportunities that arise there. Today, what we like to talk about is an issue that's been in the public sphere as well as in the media quite a lot in the last 3 or 4 months, particularly since the tragedy in Newtown in Connecticut, and that's guns and national defense or security. And for this, we usually have a broader panel, but we thought it would be actually more effective to focus the conversation and bring it down to someone who has a tremendous amount of specialized experience, particularly in security issues, but also through his career has a tremendous amount of experience in terms of public safety more generally, and that's Erroll Southers. So I'd like to welcome you, Erroll. Thank you for being with us. Erroll is the Associate Director of the National Homeland Security Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events. This is a USC center that's focused and funded by grants from Washington, and so whenever you deal with Washington, you have to come up with some neat acronym. So all those words actually reduce to the word CREATE. So it's the CREATE Center, a lot easier, focused on risk analysis and assessment and terrorism prevention. He also serves as an adjunct professor of Homeland Security and Public Policy, and before that was an appointee in the Schwarzenegger administration in the California Office of Homeland Security as the deputy director. He was actually nominated by President Obama to be the Assistant Secretary for the TSA, the Transportation Security Administration. On the fly, that's pretty good. And has been an FBI agent, a special agent. He has also, he has a long set of leadership titles. He's headed LAX's police force, and has started his career at the Santa Monica Police Department. So he's seen law enforcement and security at all levels, and has spent a lot of time around firearms and their use. So we thought it would be great to have him talk. He got his bachelor's at Brown. He has a master's in public administration here at USC, and is currently studying to get a professional doctorate in the Price School. So serious guy, he knows quite a bit, and thank you again for being with us. Please welcome Erroll.
Thank you.
Now, I should have said just some ground rules for today. We're going to talk for about 30 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes, go through some of the issues around the gun issue and gun control, as well as some security, national security things. I thought it would be useful to spend some time talking about what CREATE does and give you a sense of how we are thinking about national security in an increasingly global age. And then we'll open it up to you for questions to pose to us. As Dan Schnurr likes to say, when asking your questions, please ask them with respect and in a way that you would like someone to ask you a question. This is a topic that elicits a lot of emotion, so we want to try to keep that, but also keep this from breaking into the Jerry Springer show or something like that. So, with that, let me start by asking Erroll to talk a little bit about the dynamics of gun control. And I think it's useful just to talk, and really, before we start talking about who's right and who's wrong, just what are the issues, what are the positions that are out there, and how did these tensions emerge?
Well, first, Raphael, thank you for having me today. It really is an honor to be here. I thought I was going to be part of a panel, but this is the panel, so it really is unique, and I feel very special. Talking about gun control, and again, the first thing that comes up, obviously, is the term gun control. And the immediate, if you will, divide arises from that belief that conjures up confiscation, the allegation that someday the government's going to come and take your weapons away, and immediately you have people deciding to decide which side they're going to be on because of the gun control. So the first challenge is one of terminology, and obviously, you know, gun violence prevention was promoted on the Hill a couple of weeks ago. The challenge with that is it's got too many syllables. It really lacks specificity with terms of what you're going to do with it. If you look at gun safety, and you'll hear people say gun safety, well, gun safety to someone like me who used to be a firearms instructor conjures up the notion of a firearms training course, and that's not what we're talking about when we say gun safety in America. Firearms regulation, again, that takes us back to an issue of control. And as soon as someone hears the term regulation, they start having images of the government and those things that conspiratorial people like to suggest of one day someone coming and knocking on your door to collect everything. Illegal guns is somewhat specific, almost too specific in terms of what guns may be outlawed. And we can talk about what should be illegal or not. I thought it was quite interesting. I had the honor last year of meeting General McChrystal, and I thought it was quite interesting that about 2 weeks ago, here's a person who commanded the majority of the forces in Afghanistan. We were there, Operation Anaconda, and a number of operations during the war, and he said, there are certain weapons that we have access to that should only be in a theater of war. And I felt, who could push back against a person like General McChrystal when he says something like that? So that is certainly something that should be at least listened to, if not considered. And then the last thing is criminal access to guns. Again, it kind of narrows the focus. It's a mouthful to say. So all of that to say that when we say gun control as a phrase already tends to have people draw the line and take sides, and I think that's one of the problems we have initially.
So when we think about, I mean, this notion of control, it's almost, it gets to the heart of America's formation. When you think about the Constitution, the revolution, the breaking away from Great Britain, a lot of it was around control. And so, should we have control? I mean, who should have control when we think about weapons and militia and all those sorts of issues? I mean, when you hear people talk about this, they get the Second Amendment, and they say, you know, the Constitution says that you should not be able to control us. Are there limits to that as to how we should think about this?
I think that, well, first, the reason we're having this discussion, obviously, is because of Sandy Hook. And if I can just digress for a moment, I used to and still do security consulting to schools and was doing that before Columbine ever happened. Columbine was a game changer. I used to be on FBI SWAT. When I was on SWAT, we were on in the days when we would hope that whoever the aggressors were, they'd go somewhere, barricade themselves, we'd get a hostage negotiator or a negotiator in Samuel L. Jackson, and they could talk them down. Not real fun for a SWAT guy, because that's not what we want people to do, is get on the phone, but that was the objective. Columbine changed everything, because we realized that you couldn't wait, because you had what we call an active shooter. And so it was a game changer. There have been 182 school shootings since Columbine. I think that before I talk about control, the one thing that makes America great is that this is a hard problem. We take on hard problems. And it's unfortunate that as a nation, the only time we seem to coalesce is around moments of great joy, like the Olympics every 4 years, where for 15 days we can all agree we're from the same country. Or moments of great tragedy, like 9/11, where the day after, if you don't know, NATO invoked a treaty that they have never invoked before that said if you attack one country, you've attacked us all. And everybody here felt the same way. So as we go back to control and those things that should be regulated, I think that, first of all, if you're buying a weapon in the United States, you are in some database. And I say to my students, and I see some of them here today who say, you know, I don't want anybody to know who I am. And I say, do you have a social security number? And they say, yeah. I say, we already know everything we need to know. Okay. So you're in a database if you've bought that weapon. If you haven't bought that weapon that way and you're not in a database, for people like me in my former life, that's a problem. That is a problem. Because my biggest concern when I was in law enforcement, with all due respect to the Second Amendment, was the citizen who has the firearm in their bedroom in the nightstand that they fired 5 times 5 years ago, and now someone's in the backyard and they've decided this is the time that they might need it. So as we talk about controls, you know, there's a whole lot of responsibility that goes with buying that firearm, who has it, what database it's in, and those kinds of things. I would think that there's at least a minimal expectation of control with regards to who owns a firearm. It's the same as who owns a car, who owns a house. Those are things that I don't necessarily think the public should have access to, but someone needs to at least know who has those weapons. And if there's some reason why a person would own a weapon that they wouldn't want in a database, again, as someone in my career path would want to really find out why you feel that way. It's not illegal. It's not like controlled substances. It's a firearm. And so I do think that measure of control has to be there. So I think one of the challenges we find now is when that weapon changes ownership, it's not like a car. It's not like some other things. It can change ownership and often does. So again, myself, like others who own firearms, you know, my biggest concern is if there's ever a burglary on my weapons, because I don't want to know that someone's gotten it and perhaps going to use it for something else. The fact that it is in a database and I can give it to someone, those serial numbers and make and model immediately, means that if someone finds it, they can find it and we can know where it is. And so I think a database at a minimum, as far as a measure of control, is necessary.
Now, how far are we from getting to that kind of database? I mean, you hear people talk about there's already gun registration that's required and all that. Why are we far from that?
We're far from that because weapons, like other things, come into the country illegally. Weapons change hands, and they're not always registered when that happens. Weapons are stolen, weapons are lost, and so there's a whole collection of weapons out there that even if we had that database, and we do have one at least for people that buy it in the store, fill out all the forms, send it in, we do have one that exists, but to have every single one in there certainly doesn't exist.
Now, I've also heard that, you know, while there is the registration, there are some states that aren't actually sharing that information. Are you aware of that kind of issue?
I was not aware of that. That is interesting. I was not aware that they weren't sharing that information. I would think that at the federal level, which of course makes people nervous, that at the federal level that it's all shared amongst those 50 states, but I don't know that to be true.
All right, so let's step away from the issue of control and assume that the government is not going to take away all your weapons. There's another line of argument out there that says, well, you know, the only way that you stop people who want to shoot people is if you have a gun and you shoot them first, right? That the thought and the notion that there are guns out on the street is a major deterrent, which will lead people to think twice about that. And I think that's part of underlying the proposal that the NRA had to put an armed guard in every school. Mm-hmm. Do you have a reaction to that?
I do. Well, I'll work backwards. First, to put a guard in every school, if for no other reason, is not sustainable. It's cost prohibitive. I mean, I know a lot of former police officers that would love to have that opportunity, but it's just not sustainable. It also sends an unnecessary message. I mean, I have a 13-year-old. I used to go to schools around the country when I was doing assessments, and I saw some schools that looked like Fort Knox. That was not a comfortable feeling for a parent, that I have to go through almost a biometric scan to get into the building to see my kid, or that's necessary to protect the people inside. So to have an armed person in every school is certainly not sustainable. I am pleased to hear that a couple of things. Number one, chiefs were on the Hill last week, chiefs of police were on the Hill, and they pretty much all feel the same in that arming people that aren't in the business of being armed is not necessarily a good idea. For a lot of reasons, if for no other reason, because of all the responsibility that goes with it. Teachers should teach. Public safety officers should provide public safety. And the two don't necessarily mix well. I can tell you from a proficiency standpoint, as someone who used to shoot on a minimum of every 10 days, it's a skill set. And it's a skill set that deteriorates very quickly. And it's a skill set that deteriorates even more quickly under stress. And so arming a person for the sake of providing that protection to deter someone is not necessarily a good idea. And then, with all due respect to movies and television, people miss. I sat on a shooting review board for many years in law enforcement, and by the way, I know in movies and films they make some incredible shots, but the majority of police shootings occur within 7 meters, 7 yards of each other, within 20 feet. And that's why police officers train differently than they did years ago. They train about from here to that front row, because you're probably never going to get in a shooting incident any further than that away. And I've seen people stand in a stairwell. I've been at shooting scenes where people have been in a stairwell and missed each other in a stairwell, because that's what happens when people are under stress. And so arming people at schools is not necessarily a good idea. Is it a deterrent? There are crimes of opportunity, and then there are people who obviously, be it mental illness or whatever the motivation might be, that cause them to do certain things. We'll sort of liken this to terrorism, if you will. We can reduce the risk of shootings happening. We can never stop them from happening. And so if someone is armed, and that's the deterrent to the armed adversary, if that person's decided they're going to do it, they're going to do it, regardless of who may be present. Even if they want to take their own life during the incident, or as we used to say, commit suicide by cop and have the officers kill them at the end of the incident. But you're only going to reduce risk if that happens. I don't know of any instances, and again, as we discussed before, you're trying to prove what we call a counterfactual hypothesis. You're trying to suggest that how much prevention is actually measurable by the fact that a weapon was present. Did someone decide to not go to that school or that bank or that other building because an armed guard was there? I mean, we do have some very few documented cases where once someone's apprehended, they've said in interviews, you know, I didn't go to A because A had security and B didn't. Those things do happen. But as I said, if someone's decided that's the target, that's the target.
So I want to turn to the policy space. And and get your thoughts on, is there a reasonable middle ground? And if there is, why aren't we getting there?
I think there is a reasonable middle ground. I think that Sandy Hook was the tipping point, much like Oklahoma City was the tipping point in my world, when we all thought that terrorists had to come from someplace else and be from somewhere else and be the other. So I think there is a middle ground. I think what we have to understand is that because we can't do everything should not suggest that we do nothing. And so I think there's agreement, as I'm watching polling from NRA members versus non-NRA members, I shouldn't say versus, as compared to non-NRA members, the polling's getting closer on universal background checks. I can't see why anybody would be opposed to that if in fact you're purchasing a weapon legally. I think there's middle ground there. My policy suggestion, and this isn't something I've spent a lot of research on or done any extremely deep thought about, is that I believe there should be at least a minimum of some kind of safety course involved in terms of certification. You're already in a database to buy the weapon. You need a driver's license to drive a car. I would suggest that most people might have to have a safety course to buy the weapon. I would imagine that the majority of Americans in America, people in America today that own firearms that are not revolvers or semi-automatic, either handguns or rifles, could not take them apart if you asked them to, because they don't. Take them apart to clean them, because they don't. That bothers a person like me. That means you don't have a proficiency to use that weapon. So I think a safety course would be a nice middle ground. Again, once you separate the people who don't believe they're going to get the knock on the door from a federal agency to collect them, I think we can have a rational discussion about some kind of measures in place that would suggest how to purchase, what database they're in, what safety measures are in place, et cetera. And I do think there's a middle ground. I'm hopeful that we'll get there now, and that there don't have to be other mass incidents for that to happen. And the other thing I want to say before your next question is, I know that people talk about assault weapons, and saying an assault weapon to someone like me is saying, I got some former students in here, it's like saying terrorism. Well, what is it? An assault weapon could be a .22 pistol. It doesn't have to be an AK-47. If you fire it and you kill someone, it's an assault weapon. So I tend to disagree with people who have decided there should be a discussion about certain magazine capacities. There should be a discussion about certain weapons. But I would imagine, again, not having the facts and figures right in front of me, that the majority of deaths in America by firearms are probably by handguns. And the second thing I'll say is that unfortunately, we're on a trajectory right now where firearms-related deaths in America will exceed car accident fatalities in 2 years. It's time for us to do something.
All right, and I think that's actually a good segue to the other topic I wanted to talk about, which is broader anti-terrorism action. And your center, CREATE, is doing a lot on that. Maybe it'd be good to talk a little bit about what CREATE does, and then I'd really like to turn to the notions of what successes we've seen in the field.
Okay.
So, CREATE.
Sure. So we are the first Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence. There are 12 in the country. We were created, no pun intended, in 2004. We're a collection of 21 institutions, including ourselves, in the United States and Canada and Australia and Israel and the UK. As Raphael mentioned, we work on risk and economic analysis of terrorism events, which means that essentially, as it relates to anything that has to do with terrorism, we can work on anything, because there's always a risk component, there's always an economic consequence as a result. So we get to look at the entire spectrum. There are centers that are focused on certain disciplines, such as foreign and animal zoonotic diseases, borders, human behaviors. We can work on all of the above because we're talking about risk and economic consequences. So we are, if you don't know, we are housed in Ronald Tudor Hall, the other end of the campus in Viterbi, and we share our center with Price. A number of people like myself are on the faculty at Price. And we work on some very hard problems. One of the first things that we did was an economic analysis study of 9/11. If you don't remember, if any of you were here or near an airport on September 12, 2001, you remember that the skies had nothing in them except military aircraft and helicopters. We did an economic analysis of what happens when that kind of action or policy action takes place. If you're not aware, bin Laden also did an economic analysis of 9/11, down to how many people lost their jobs in America. And it was quite interesting. So we did that. We've done a number of studies in areas of risk analysis, decision analysis. We have a group that's called adaptive adversaries because we understand that terrorists over time have learned to look at our countermeasures and adapt so they can compromise them with something new and improved. And so we have taken on issues that I can speak publicly about, people don't even know about. For example, surface-to-air missiles, man-pads, they're actually shoulder-fired missiles, man-portable aerial defense systems. Back in when Taliban, before they decided that they were going to align with bin Laden, we supplied them with surface-to-air missiles, and that's actually how they beat the Russians in Afghanistan. Well, a lot of those weapons, thousands of those weapons, were left there. So we did an economic analysis study and a risk study on what's the risk of a surface-to-air missile being used here in the United States. If we could develop a countermeasure and place it on a plane, would it be cost-effective to do that? And so those are the kinds of studies that we've done. More recently, the successes we've had, we have a whole suite of, if you will, software called ARMOR, which is Assistant for Randomized Monitoring Over Routes. It was created by Milen Tambay, who's a professor in the Viterbi School of Engineering. He's probably one of the world's leading game theorists who's here on our faculty. And to give you the Reader's Digest version, LAX is arguably the #1 airport terrorist target in the United States and has a challenge of 5 roadways in and out of the airport. And so how do you protect 5 roadways? So it's sort of like protecting all the schools in America. We would love to put a checkpoint on each roadway 24 hours a day. It's cost prohibitive. And so we came to Milen because we understood he had a game theory platform to randomize the checkpoints. And we've actually done that. It's called, as I mentioned, it's ARMOR. It's on our aviation version of ARMOR. And so what we've done, segueing into our adaptive adversaries component of CREATE, we understand that terrorists plan. They conduct surveillances, they look at targets, they spend a lot of resources doing things so that they don't make the mistake. And so a terrorist that's looking at a target like LAX, if they have to guess when the checkpoint is there, they're probably going to be deterred and go somewhere else. It's been very successful. A significant increase in the seizures of weapons, the seizures of narcotics. You'd be surprised how many people bring guns to the airport to pick people up. But what we didn't do in that algorithm, again, is we didn't remove the human element. The selection of the cars, the selection of those people was up to the officers themselves. So there's a component there with all of our modeling and all of our agent-based modeling that we do that we'll never be able to model human behavior. So we now have ARMOR in airports. We now have ARMOR that's been implemented in the ports of Boston, New York, LA, and Long Beach, where the Coast Guard is now selecting ships at sea in a random manner. We have ARMOR Trusts, and I'm not going to go through all the acronyms. ARMOR Trusts is now with the LA Sheriff's Department putting teams on rail, or on passenger rail, light rail here in the city in a randomized way. And it's done in such a manner that the officers and the deputies don't even know from week to week, day to day, where they're going to be deployed because the algorithm's telling them where to go. When you hear of people saying, you know, we're deploying random or we're doing random X, we don't have a capacity mentally to randomize. You will fall into a pattern, whether it's every 100, every 10, every 10,000, and so we understand it. So the algorithm takes that factor out, and it really does make it random. So that a person has to guess. So it's gone very well. If I may, it's now gone through a process over the past year of being a university startup, and now it's actually a company that's formed. And it all began in 2007 at the airport with just an experiment because we knew Professor Tambay was in this area, and it's gone quite well. So I'm responsible for transitional research, which is what this is, which means that your tax dollars fund our center, and Congress wants a return on investment. And so when we can speak to real practical application of research to make America more safe and secure, it's a return on investment for Congress and a return on investment for the American people.
So just on that, which thank you for that, I think is very interesting. The interdisciplinary nature of what you guys are doing, I think, is something that we don't talk about a lot. You know, first of all, understanding the psychology of a terrorist, and how you would go about doing an operation from an operational, logistical planning perspective is really significant. Then the randomization is, you know, that's an economist's issue, that's an engineering issue, and it brings together a bunch of disciplines in ways that we haven't really done very often in this country, and I think that it's actually quite unique in its approach, and that's interesting. Have you found it difficult to convince folks in Washington that this approach is the way you need to go? I mean, how hard has it been to convince politicals that you need to really get into some of these scientific things if you want to be effective?
We've been very successful. Again, the proof is in the results of our transitional research, the fact that we can point to applications, and we've got the endorsement of our stakeholders, the airport, the Coast Guard, the Federal Air Marshal Service, because we're using this application in a classified manner for federal air marshals. So they're only convinced when they see the return on investment. We publish a lot. Papers, as impressive as they are not very convincing when you're talking to people that write policy.
You mean they're not reading your papers?
But we publish a lot. We confer a lot of degrees, but the proof for us in terms of convincing people on the Hill is pure application. When the Coast Guard says, we're going to use armor to decide our offshore patrols as the standard, that's a winner, and that works for us.
Are there folks who aren't buying this? You know, we've all been in the TSA line at the airport, and we've all had that moment when it's like, you know what? I don't know why they're making me take off my shoes or take my belt off. What do you say to folks like that? I mean, have we missed the boat? I mean, are there other ways we should be thinking about this?
I think that, well, there are people who are not buying it, that's for sure. Unfortunately, we live in a culture that's very, I'm sure no one in this audience would know this, we live in a culture that wants everything now. It's very immediate. And so when we're dealing with adversaries who think in centuries and exercise an extraordinary level of patience, when something doesn't happen for 6 to 12 months, people begin, as they're doing now, to suggest this is no longer a threat. It's overblown, it's over-resourced. Arguably, could we be leaner? Probably. But again, it's all about risk. And you're talking about a very low-frequency event that can have a very high impact. And so how do you balance that? The other thing we don't do a good job of, Raphael, is we do a very poor job of education and awareness in this country. When I've told people, and I won't do it today, but when I've told people the thinking that went into removing shoes in the first place, and the whole history of Al-Qaeda's investment in shoe bomb technology, and how successful they've been, and I've shown people pictures of when we took Richard Reed's shoe, we rebuilt it, took it out to the desert, put it on some airline chairs, and blew it up and showed people what it looked like. They're believers at that point. We don't do a very good job of explaining why shoes, why liquids, and then we don't stay on the same page with other countries. For example, everybody's dropping the liquids, aerosols, and gel ban next year except for us. So you have to decide either they all have it wrong or we do. And there's no unification, no harmonization of international standards, which presents a problem. No one's taking their shoes off anyplace else except here. And I travel throughout the world like a lot of people in here, so you have to again wonder, do we have it right? Do they all have it wrong? One of the things that we do very well is we knee-jerk on policy implementation. And then once we put it out there, we're afraid to take it away. And I think that's a huge mistake. And then lastly, what I'll say is we have to do a much better job of convincing the public about the human element in terms of the defender side of what we do. I spend a lot of time in Israel. I teach there. I have friends and family there. And those 19 and 20-year-olds that are what they call selectors at the airport, they put me on a plane like they're putting their own family on the plane. I feel that when they ask me the 15 questions repeatedly, the same one. I think if people felt here, and it's not to say that I don't have a tremendous amount of respect for everybody here in this country that provides public safety and national safety, because I believe they're all of the same dedication level that I am. But sometimes people aren't convinced. And it speaks to demeanor, it speaks to professionalism, it speaks to leadership, and I think we fall short in some of those areas when people encounter those people at the airport throughout the country, and you go to other countries and it's quite serious, and they take it very, very seriously. Last time I was in Israel 2 trips ago with my family, and they had never been there before with me. My wife and daughter are there, and they told my wife that my daughter didn't look like hers, and she's sure that's her daughter. That's very, very intimidating, and went on for 5 more questions to challenge her about, is that really your daughter? I got detained in Frankfurt once because my passport, one letter in my last name between the T and the H shifted on the passport. It looked like it may have been tweaked. And I had too much identification, actually. I had more identification than you can think about in my possession. Have a seat until we know who you really are and where you're going. So until America reaches that level where, with all due respect to someone who, we can have a discussion another time about profiling, until we reach a level where if something looks suspicious, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck, until we reach a level where we can tell someone, I'm going to talk to you until I'm convinced of who you are without feeling like the person's going to say they're being profiled, we're not going to be there yet, and we're not there. And you bring up a very good point. I think it's training, I think it's education and awareness, and then I think, again, this is just a leadership moment on a lot of levels.
So I want to open this up to the audience. We've been having a conversation around, I want to say gun control, but I know that's not the right way to say it. So about what we should do with weaponry in the public sphere, as well as national security and homeland security, and how we manage those threats and risks. So yes, and if you, before you ask your question, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, yes, Stephen Hubbard, DPPD program. Has anyone thought about putting a tax on either firearms or bullets to help pay for the social costs? Because the social cost is about $60 billion, is one of the numbers I've seen repeated a lot. And 118 million bullets, so that works out to about 50 cents a bullet. And I can't imagine what the NRA would do if you said, well, we're going to put 50 cents a bullet. But it's the idea of making the people who are part of, you know, I don't want to say the problem, but the firearms community help shoulder the cost, the social cost of having so many guns.
I'm smiling because not because your question isn't serious, because I'm thinking of Chris Rock's skit where he talks about bullet control. And he said if bullets cost $5,000 each, people would think about it. But I don't know that that's ever been thought of. That's an interesting idea. I will only offer you this, and again, I live in a world of adaptive adversaries. So if you decide you're going to tax me on bullets, I'll hand load in my garage, which is what most of those people do anyway.
Material goes into it. It's the idea of either putting a tax on guns and or ammunition partially to help pay for defray the social cost.
Yeah, I'm not going to suggest that's a bad idea. I don't know what cigarettes cost now, but I don't know that people have slowed down. I hope they have. Again, I would be supportive, and it's a good idea. I would be supportive of anything that reduces the risk. And this is a comprehensive problem. This is just not a weapon problem. And it's just not a mental illness problem. This is a societal challenge. And it's going to take a whole lot of things to reduce the risk. And then we'll never be able to measure the amount of prevention that's going to be in place or that's occurred. I think one of the things that would be interesting and I've heard people suggest this, is there have to be consequences for people that are violating the laws we have right now. And I don't know that that happens. What happens if you buy a firearm illegally and get caught? I don't know. Or if you sell a firearm without checking with someone? I don't know. If there's no consequence, then there's no influence to change the behavior.
And I'll just say that, as an economist, I like these tax, put the real cost out there. There is a political issue, and the notion of taxing in a space around the Second Amendment will be extremely difficult. So we're talking about just registering that I bought a gun or I own one being difficult. Now you're going to say I got to pay for every bullet that I want to use at the range. That one may be a tougher lift.
Okay.
Are there other questions? Yeah, right here.
Hi, Mr. Southers. My name's Andrew Myers. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, really 5 minutes away from where the Aurora Theater shootings were this year. And I really appreciate what you said about needing to come together and sort of reach a consensus. And I think we need that kind of thinking more on a lot of issues. But on gun control, when you see what happened in Sandy Hook, when you see what happened in these theaters, you really want something that's, you obviously can't eliminate it, but something that's going to drastically reduce these incidents. And I guess my question for you is, political considerations aside, what steps do we take to drastically limit these kind of massacres?
Well, I'll be honest with you, and I've said this to my students, and I'm not a psychiatrist. I'll have to defer, or psychologist, or in that area, I have to defer to Dr. Natoli on this one. So I'll just say it in as non-scholarly a way as I can. There are people who are just crazy. And I don't know much about the Aurora shooting other than I don't think they've linked him to any group or any ideology. So he fits in that category. How could we have prevented that from happening? I don't know the answer to that question. I agree with you, we have to do something. And again, to not be able to do everything doesn't mean do nothing. But access to firearms in this country is unfortunately a right and not hard to do. Even in Israel, where it's not uncommon, in fact, I don't walk into a business in Israel that doesn't have a security officer inside. And in fact, the joke in Israel in the malls there is they want to know what you're bringing in. Here we want to know what you're taking out. But the point is, in a country like that lives with a suicide threat every single day, and it's a democracy, they have to have a reason to have a firearm. Even though after age 20, the majority of people have served in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, they have to have a reason. Here, we have a right to have a gun. So it makes it really hard. And for those people like the individual in Aurora who just decided he's going to go and do that, I will say this, since it's part of my research. I think society decides what they will and won't tolerate. And there's a moral issue here. And people don't, as the Secret Service did a study years ago after a string of school shootings in 1999, 2000, 2001, and shooters that were still in custody, mostly young people. And the one thing that they came up with is they didn't just decide to do that day. Just like Harris and Klebold at Columbine. It wasn't just that day. People watched them do things for a long time. The Heil Hitlers in the bowling alley, the black trench coats getting beat up by the football team. People watched that for a long time. So now you have to decide if we're going to do anything about it, or if we're going to do anything to change their behavior, to protect them, or whatever it's going to be. These incidents don't just happen. People don't just decide, I'm going to go load my weapon today and go down to the theater. So people watch these things. What you're not hearing about are the number of what I'll call saves, where families and communities have actually done things. There used to be an organization, I'm sorry it doesn't exist anymore. There was a student organization, I believe in Oregon or Washington, where they were counting incidents where they had stopped school shootings. And it's too bad they didn't get a lot of press, because kids decided, this is my school, and when I hear about somebody who's going to do something, I'm going to tell someone, and it worked. So I think that's really important when you have societies that do that and they're willing to take that on. But I think that's the only way you get people to move in terms of that. Last thing I'll say is, I gave a talk in a temple in Century City a couple weeks ago, and they said, Mr. Southers, no one's a more targeted community than the Jewish community. What do you think we can do to reduce the risk? And it was a Saturday night, and the temple was full. I said, you've done it. I said, you're all here. I said, the majority of people in this country don't even know who lives next door. I said, you're in the same room with each other every week. You all know each other. You all know if somebody has a problem, and you all know if somebody needs something. I said, that's a huge step in protecting yourself. And so that's my long speech of saying moral issues, societal cultures that have to become more interactive. We have to stop walking around doing this and start talking to people. I tell my students all the time, as the CEO of Google gave a commencement speech last year, and it's odd for him to say this, but he did. He said, have a conversation. And I really believe that. And because, again, these shooters, some of them are troubled, some of them have an ideology and an agenda, but they don't just decide one day, I'm going to go do this.
Yeah, I've got two quick questions. Dave Meister, I'm in the International Relations School. The first one is you talking in international relations about the CNN effect. Right now, you turn on CNN, when it was November, it was election. When it was, now it's guns. So every, not to belittle, but every little shooting is all over CNN, and these shootings were not being publicized before the tragedy in Newtown. How long, do you think that, in your expert opinion, do you think that this CNN effect will kind of go away before policy happens? It's kind of a, or do you think that some action, because eventually the policymakers will move on to the next big thing in policy. That's unfortunately the way our media and political system works.
I think you're correct, especially in Western cultures. I don't see us moving away from that. We tend to stay fixated on the last 24-hour cycle of whatever it is. You're absolutely correct. I wrote an article after Sandy Hook for a site about copycats, because in law enforcement, the biggest fear we have, especially in the first day, several days to a week, are copycats, no matter what it is, whether it's a shooting at a temple or someone trying to blow up a theater or a school shooting. That's our biggest concern. I don't see it going away. Whereas other cultures, I mean, if you've ever been to the Middle East, with all due respect to how seriously they take security and how much they value life, as much as we do, if something happens this afternoon, that business will be open tomorrow. And it goes away because they've decided we're going to go on with life. We do tend to dwell on it, but that's just who we are. Whether it's a school shooting or a Notre Dame football player, we stay on it until the next thing happens. And so unfortunately, that's just the culture we live in, and it gets a lot of traction. And for people like me, the biggest concern for that are copycats, because they're out there, and we had a slew of them after Sandy Hook. Some that were stopped. In fact, I could think of at least two that were prevented right after Sandy Hook, because you have these people that are sitting in places thinking about this, and they see someone go out and do it, and you have two issues. One, well, he did it, I can do it. And two, which we saw after Columbine, we had a can you top this attitude. We found people that were being stopped in school shootings, and they would all cite, I wanted to exceed Columbine's death count. It does tend to fuel it, and I don't think it's ever going to go away. It's people do have a right to know, and I don't know how long. I don't know that we will never reach a stage that they have in other countries where they deal with it and they move on. I just don't see that happening.
Are there other questions? Back here.
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm an undergraduate in Dornsife. Kind of based on what you were just talking about. So kind of talk about how, in a lot of ways, the media glorifies some of these things. And, if you're going to be, especially now, if you have a shooting, it's going to be on the news, it's going to be on CNN. And then again, it also inspires copycats we were kind of talking about. So there's obviously a lot of negatives about that. But there's also a lot of positives about keeping it in the public consciousness and making sure this stuff doesn't fade away, because there have been so many major problems that have just kind of been swept under the rug after a while. So how do you kind of balance those two things of keeping it in the public consciousness but not glorifying it and not trying to encourage copycats? And how do you balance that? And do you use that a net positive or negative? Or?
You raise a good point. I think keeping it in the public consciousness is good if it's done in a way that's going to help us finish some races and not run laps. and then not go away. You know, with all due respect, the Brady Act came about because a president got shot. It's interesting what it takes to move us as a nation to decide to do something. It's usually the individual or the number. We're not moved by the way, there are, I want to make sure I'm absolutely right, there's 87 gun deaths in America every day. 183 people get shot in America every day. I used to have 2 BlackBerries. I'm glad I don't have 2 anymore. I used to have 2 BlackBerries, and 1 BlackBerry was for work. And there's a system called Racer here in LA. And I find out about every shooting incident that happens. There was a period of time where more people were getting shot here than in Iraq. That doesn't get any traction. In fact, if you don't get killed in a shooting, it doesn't even get on the news anymore. So I'm good with keeping it in the public eye, and I think you're absolutely right if it moves us to action. And it's got to move us. I think what needs to happen now is we need to, as a nation, show what we can do about this. I don't know if it comes as a surprise. I'm part of the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, where I have no idea what my colleagues' political affiliation is. That's not important. We're all there for the same reason. So if we can come together on that issue, on the fact that I believe some of the smartest people on the planet are in this country. And I don't believe this country, there's nothing we can't take on if we have the political will to do it. Now let's just see if we can do it. I think you're absolutely right. I hope it doesn't go away if it makes us do something. I'd like to sit here a year from now and point to the successes.
I worked for the Metropolitan Water District, and between working for a utility and playing war a lot when I was a little kid, I can imagine many ways to mess up infrastructure. And I don't cheer every time I hear Al-Qaeda or one of their various copycat organizations is used a truck bomb or something else, but I think, thank goodness, they haven't thought of anything more sophisticated. And I was wondering, as you look at sort of the continual struggle between the terrorists and prevention, are they moving on to more sophisticated things, or are they still more focused on, we're going to, set off some explosives? In other words, is there a progression in technology? If you frustrate them enough, are they going to try and jump to something else, something more sophisticated?
That's an interesting question. The first thing is that they are adaptive. They have not gone away. There are more homegrown threats than you think. So there's 2 issues here. One is, have they moved on? And so that's why we have people like Laura and Rob who are here, who are in our center, because we are trying to leverage the thinking of people to understand what might be the next threat. What we do in America very well in terms of policies, process, and technology considerations is address yesterday's threat. I was part of a study 2 years ago where we had a greenfield airport experiment. We took 15 students from the United States, 15 students from the UK, put them in a room and said, design the airport of 2027 around security with no restrictions. Why? Because they think different than I do. And so now we've come up with research options for what might be countermeasures in the future based on how they think. Terrorists are no different. It's no reason why terrorists try to recruit from every single academic discipline you can think of, and they leverage those people. They're not recruiting Americans because they can't find enough people overseas. They're recruiting Americans because Americans can articulate their message in a whole lot of different ways, and should come as no surprise that the Americans that went to organizations like Al-Qaeda wound up being part of their media arm. It sends a huge message when you get a Westerner doing that. On the other hand, we have a whole list of homegrown violent extremists here that we tend to not get on the radar screen as well, which we need to pay attention to, which are growing in numbers. And I shared some things with my colleagues this morning who are here today that you would probably find pretty disturbing if you knew what was happening right here amongst people who were born here. So yes, they are adaptive. Yes, they are adapting. Again, it's a low frequency threat that we have to pay attention to, and what we're trying to do is stay one step ahead. As we come up with there's a magazine, and I don't encourage anybody to go to the sites that I go to because but you're at your own risk. Rob is smiling, he knows what I mean. I go to a lot of websites that, if it weren't for me, it probably would attract some attention. But there's a magazine called Inspire. And Inspire was Al-Qaeda's magazine. And they write articles about how they're trying to defeat canines, explosive detection canines, how they're trying to defeat whole body imaging at the airport, organic metal detectors, inorganic metal detectors. That's what they do. These people are engineers and scientists just like we are. They have research and development arms just like we do. This is not a ragtag group of people that sits in a cave eating off sterno, wrapped in blankets, as a lot of people think. Very sophisticated, very intelligent, very patient, and here and abroad. And that's what keeps us trying to think ahead of them. Because yes, they're very adaptive.
So we're just about out of time. Erroll, I was hoping that we'd have a little more time to talk about the homegrown threats, as that's an area where that does not get very much attention, but is, as you say, growing in significance. You've taught me quite a bit in the last 24 hours on that. It's something that we all should pay attention to. But I wanted to just try to summarize some things and see if there's anything you wanted to put as a bow on top. In listening to you and through this conversation, a couple of things jumped out that you said that I thought were quite interesting. The first is around the action and what it is we're trying to accomplish. And are we trying to accomplish a reduction in risk or a removal of risk? And those are really two different things, and I think the latter is actually more difficult. And in that context, you said this a couple times, the issue is, if we can't do everything, does that mean we can't do anything?
Right.
And how do we think about what things are actionable in that context? And then a phrase I never heard before, but I really like, is this idea: if we're going to do something, let's do something to finish a race rather than run laps. Right? We don't want to come back to this conversation or these issues 3 months from now, 8 months from now, 2 years from now. Let's try to finish some things. I think that's important. A second thing that you said, which we didn't emphasize a lot, but you said it actually in two ways, focused on the issue of responsibility. Responsibility, if you own a gun, or if you're going to have a firearm, there are some implicit responsibilities that perhaps we should be thinking about making explicit. And that may take us away toward reducing sort of some of the randomness that happens in terms of firearms. And then the second type of responsibility, which I think is one that we actually, I take for granted, and perhaps I shouldn't, is this notion of the responsibility of morality and our responsibility of community. And that community is in itself a defense mechanism. And that you start to notice the unusual, and you can recognize where potential threats are, because the interpersonal gets you a depth of understanding that you can't get from a random person walking on a street. And that's really important and significant. And it's something that I think we all should take with us as we move forward. Is there anything you wanted to add on top of that?
No, actually, you've summarized it far better than I could have. Again, just a real privilege to be here on a very hot topic issue. I think that what I would say to finish this, or to put a bow on it, is when the cameras are off and people aren't within a certain geographic location in the United States, I think the majority of people can be very rational about this discussion and understand that some things can be done. And again, I think this is a real leadership opportunity to come together and point to some successes later on. I mean, I'll be honest, I learned as a Boy Scout how to shoot, and it was fun, and I really appreciate and treasured those times. And I don't want to see those kinds of opportunities go away because of a miseducation of what firearms are and what they can do and how they're used. However, there are responsibilities as an individual and as a society that we have to take on. And I think the time has come where we can actually do something. And again, I just think if we can't do it, who can? I think we're the best country that can take this on.
Well, thank you very much, Erroll. It's been great. I wanted to, before I close, and ask you to thank him for a tremendous discussion. We're here every week. You should definitely come back. We have more programs just like this that are thought-provoking and interesting. And I wanted to just do a little shout-out for a Bedrosian Center event that's happening in a couple of weeks. We have a speaker series called Leaders from the West. And Richard Reardon, the former mayor of Los Angeles, will be here, talk about what it takes to lead a big city and some of the issues that the city faces. So with that, I want to please ask you to join me in thanking Erroll Southers for
Thank you.
tremendous.
Thank you. Thank you.